Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're exploring forensic science. And you know how much you love true crime, so this is going to be right up your alley. We found this expert, Joseph Scott Morgan. Joss Scott?
Joss Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's not only worked on some of the biggest cases out there, but he can also explain the science behind it all in a way that is seriously captivating.
Yeah, Joss Scott, I've heard that name before. He's like a major figure in forensics, right? I think I've even seen him giving expert commentary on the news. He always has this really interesting perspective, like a blend of, real world experience and deep knowledge.
It's true. He's done it all. Professor, author, expert witness on TV, you name it. But the thing that really caught our attention was his expertise in the U.S. coroner system.
The coroner system.
Yeah, you might not be familiar with it, but it's basically the network of medical examiners and coroners that investigate deaths that are sudden, unexpected, or could be criminal.
Oh, okay. So it's like the starting point for any forensic investigation.
But
yeah, gotcha.
Exactly. It's like the foundation. And what's so cool about Joss Scott is that he's not just like a textbook expert on the procedures and science. He's also a fantastic storyteller.
Well, that's interesting because his book, what's it called?
Blood Beneath My Feet.
Blood Beneath My Feet, yeah. It won a Georgia Author of the Year award.
Yeah.
And even the title itself, it's so evocative. It makes you think about all the stories he must have from his time as a death investigator.
Right, totally. It makes you wonder, why is storytelling so important in forensic science?
Right.
You'd think it's all just cold, hard facts.
Yeah, facts, data, evidence.
But then you think about how these experts have to explain their findings to a jury, and it kind of makes sense that they need to be able to craft a compelling narrative, right?
It's true. When you put it like that, it makes total sense. It's like they have to connect the dots for people who aren't scientists.
Yeah.
And, if you think about it more broadly, the way forensic evidence is presented can actually influence public opinion, too.
Well, for sure. It can even affect the outcome of a trial. It's not just about having the data. You have to make it understandable, relatable, almost like, a really good true crime documentary.
Exactly. And that's what Joss Scott seems to excel at. He bridges that gap between the hard science and the human element of it all. So to really dig into this, we're going to be checking out an interview he did on the Dre and Smiley The Inner Circle podcast. It's episode 37.
Okay.
We want to learn how he does it. You know how he makes forensic science so captivating.
Before we jump in, there's one case that really stands out in Joss Scott's career, the Casey Anthony case.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, that was a media circus, so many twists and turns, and the evidence was incredibly complex.
Right.
A case like that, with all the public scrutiny, the legal battles, it would demand a forensic expert who's not just brilliant, but also, able to explain those findings under immense pressure. Oh, absolutely. The Casey Anthony case had everyone glued to the news, and the outcome sparked so much debate. Being involved in something like that must have been insanely challenging. And speaking of challenges, the coroner system itself isn't without its hurdles, especially when it comes to these high-profile or controversial cases.
It makes you wonder how experts like Joss Scott navigate those complexities. I know he's been pretty vocal about some of the issues within the system, right? Like inconsistencies in training, resources, that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. And that's why his perspective is so valuable, He has this deep understanding of the system, its strengths, its weaknesses.
Right.
And get this, he even has his own podcast.
Oh, really? What's it called?
Body Bags.
Body Bags. And okay, that's an attention-grabbing title.
I know, right? It seems like he's really committed to making this field accessible, not just for academics and legal professionals.
It's interesting, the choice of that title, Body Bags. It's like he's inviting listeners into this world of, death investigation, a world that most people would probably shy away from. It's a bold move. Suggests he's willing to tackle the tough stuff.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the ways experts are connecting with people today. A podcast lets him go beyond the courtroom, the classroom, and reach a whole new audience. People who might be curious about forensic science, but wouldn't necessarily, pick up a textbook,
That's a good point. And especially in today's world where, misinformation spreads so easily, making this information accessible, like Joss Scott's doing, it could actually help combat some of that and encourage more, informed public discourse.
Okay, so let's unpack this interview and see what insights Joss Scott has about forensic science, storytelling, and his unique experiences. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right.
So, diving into this interview, where should we begin?
Well, you brought up the Casey Anthony case earlier, and it really highlights how crucial but also challenging forensic evidence can be in these really high-profile cases. Imagine all that media attention, the public scrutiny, the legal strategies at play, the pressure on a forensic expert must be intense.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the science anymore. You have to be so meticulous, knowing that every detail is going to be examined, potentially challenged. And in a case like that, as controversial as the Casey Anthony case, where public opinion was so divided, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, the outcome sparks so much debate. It makes you think about how forensic experts, they need to be more than just scientists. They need to be skilled communicators too.
For sure.
They have to present these complex findings in a way that's clear, objective, and understandable, especially for a jury that might not have a scientific background.
And that's where the storytelling comes in, right?
Exactly.
It's not enough to just throw out facts and figures. You have to weave them into a narrative, one that makes sense, that connects with people, even on an emotional level.
This idea of storytelling, it's so central to Joss Scott's book, Blood Beneath My Feet. It's not your typical scientific account, it's a personal journey into the world of a death investigator, full of experiences and reflections that really bring the subject to life.
It's so interesting. It's like he's using his personal experiences to help us, regular people, understand the human impact of these cases. He's making it relatable.
Right. It reminds us that behind all the technical stuff, the lab analysis, there are real people affected by these investigations. And for the forensic expert, there's this huge responsibility to make sure their work is accurate, unbiased, and presented in a way that serves justice.
It makes you wonder how someone like Joss Scott handles that balance, the scientific side and the emotional weight of the cases he works on, especially with all the media attention and scrutiny surrounding some of them.
That's a great point. It really speaks to the dedication and resilience of people in this field. They're dealing with the darkest parts of humanity, but they're also the ones using science to seek the truth, to bring closure to families. It's a tough job, no doubt, but an incredibly important one.
It is a balance, isn't it? Objectivity and empathy, science and storytelling. And it seems like Joss Scott has found a way to navigate both sides with grace and skill. His work, from his books to his podcast, it all shows.
And speaking of his podcast, Body Bags,
Yeah.
the title alone, it's bold, even a little provocative, but it speaks to his willingness to tackle the reality of death investigation head on,
Right.
He's not shying away from the difficult stuff. He's embracing it and inviting listeners to explore that world with him.
There's something really admirable about that approach. It's like he's saying, look, this is what I do. It matters, and I'm going to share it with you, even if it's not always easy to hear. It's a kind of transparency that can be really powerful, especially in a field that's often seen as secretive.
And it taps into that human curiosity we all have. That fascination with the unknown true crime is so popular these days. I think it's partly because it lets us explore that darker side of human nature, to try and understand why people do the things they do, but from a safe distance.
You're right. And by choosing a podcast as his platform, Joss Scott's making that exploration even more accessible. He's taking these complex forensic concepts and making them understandable, even engaging, for a wider audience. It's like he's demystifying the whole world of forensic science.
I love that, demystifying the world of forensic science. That's a perfect way to put it. He's not just an expert, he's a guide, leading us through this fascinating and sometimes unsettling world, and he does it with expertise and even a touch of humor.
It is refreshing, having an expert who's not afraid to be both knowledgeable and approachable. And by sharing his experiences, his insights, he's helping to create a more informed public ag, which ultimately benefits the whole criminal justice system, right?
Absolutely. That's one of the big takeaways from this deep dive. The impact of Joss Scott's work goes beyond solving crimes. He's changing the way we think about them, how we understand the role of forensic science, and how storytelling shapes our perception of it all.
And that's why it's so important to highlight voices like his. Voices that are both credible and engaging, that can break down these complex topics and make them relevant to our everyday lives. What other things stood out to you from the interview?
One thing that struck me was how much Joss Scott emphasized the human element of forensic science. He talked about how, even when dealing with death and violence, investigators have to maintain empathy and respect for the victims.
It's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details of the investigation, but remembering that behind every case, there are real people who are grieving. The way investigators handle those cases, how they interact with families, it all has a huge impact on the healing process.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure. And it kind of brings us back to that question we started with, the connection between forensic science and storytelling. It seems like they're way more connected than you might think, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen how Joss Scott uses storytelling to make these complex forensic concepts more accessible and more engaging. But it goes even deeper than that. The way evidence is presented, the narratives that are built around it, it can actually shape public perception of the whole criminal justice system.
You're right. It's like those true crime documentaries. They're so compelling, but they have this power to really influence public opinion even before a case goes to trial. Makes you realize how important it is for these experts to be aware of the stories they're telling and the impact those stories can have.
It really does. You know what? It makes me wonder about you, the listener, thinking about how powerful storytelling is in forensic science. How might it affect how you perceive cases you hear about in the news? Do you find yourself drawn to certain narratives more than others? And do you ever question how evidence is presented or the conclusions they draw?
Those are really good questions for all of us to think about. It's easy to get swept up in a good story, but it's so important to remember there's always more than one side. And as, people who are taking in this information, we have a responsibility to be critical thinkers, to question what we're seeing and hearing, and to try and find different perspectives.
I think Jeff Scott's work is a great model for that, approaching these topics with expertise, but also a good dose of skepticism. He doesn't shy away from the complexities or the controversies, and he really encourages his listeners to think critically about what they're hearing.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive into his world so fascinating. He's not just solving crimes, he's challenging us to think differently about forensic science, its impact on how we understand justice, truth, even storytelling itself.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that behind the headlines, the courtroom drama, there's this whole world of dedicated people working hard to uncover the truth, often in really difficult situations.
And that's definitely something worth recognizing. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. How can we, as individuals, be more discerning, better at filtering the information we receive, especially when it comes to complex and often sensationalized topics like forensic science?
It's a great question to ponder. And if you're interested in learning more about this world, I highly recommend checking out Joe Scott's podcast, Body Bags, or his book, Blood Beneath My Feet. It won an award.
Yeah.
They offer such a captivating and insightful look into the mind of an expert who's not afraid to challenge the norms and spark meaningful conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of forensic science. Until next time, stay curious.